I am a professor of ethnomusicology and American Indian Studies at UCLA. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I learned flute making from my father. And I also am actually somebody who does woodworking and flute making and works with wood and these kinds of things. So it's a family tradition. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was the wood itself, from the standpoint of somebody who's a native person who makes instruments and native attitudes and wood and construction methods and things like this. So it's going to be non-theoretical, we'll put it that way. But what I wanted to start with is actually something from my mother's family. I had a great-grandmother from the Grand River Reservation in Canada, who's Mohawk. And I really love the Iroquoian, Mohawk people, Haudenosaunee, attitude toward trees themselves, which I think I inherited to a certain extent. And you can read it, but I'm also going to read it to you. This is part of the Iroquois Thanksgiving address, which is done every year at a ceremony called Thanksgiving. And people thank everything around them. And this is what is said to trees. Now we turn our thoughts to the trees. The earth has many families of trees who all have their own instructions and uses. Some provide us with shelter and shade, others with fruit, beauty, and other useful things. Many people of the world use a tree as a symbol of peace and strength. With one mind, we greet and thank the tree life. And now our minds are one. I think this really summarizes beautifully the way that the native peoples of North America feel about the trees around them. It's a real attitude of reverence. Okay? Now, first of all, wood is a spiritual thing. I think this is something that comes through a little bit with what Tyler was talking about. But wood is spiritual in the sense that the tree represents the land where it grows. It is kind of a citizen of that place. And you're very much aware of that when you work with wood that is brought in from far away, which happens sometimes. Trees hold spiritual life. And that life can live on in the instrument that is made from the tree. Trees are appreciated, not just as I mentioned with the Thanksgiving address, but also if you're out with people walking in an area where there are really large, majestic trees, also when those trees are next to water. It seems to be those two things are very important. People will tie flags on them made of different colors of cotton cloth. Or they will take tobacco, the kind that you smoke, and put a little bit in a piece of cloth, tie it up, and then tie that to the tree as an offering to the spirit of the tree. Sacred tobacco. So there is a sense that trees, I'm just trying to think of a way to put it. Trees are revered. I guess that's the best way to talk about it. And there's a sense, too, that individual trees and types of trees have songs, and they have their own songs. And my grandfather, when he would take me out walking, we lived up near Mount Lassen, actually, when I was a kid. And we would go out, and he would tell me that the land had a song, and the trees were singing, and I needed to be able to hear the songs of the individual trees. So it isn't just about wood, it's about the tree as a living being and how we interact with that. Now, as far as the usage of wood, it's interesting because speaking for this conference has made me stop and really think about how different kinds of instruments are used in different geographic areas, and a realization that is related in many ways to the trees that are there. For example, you don't find, see this drum here? I'm circling on it a little bit. You don't find these kinds of drums in, say, the Northeast or even the Southeast. You only find this kind of drum in areas where there is wood that is bendable. This is actually made from the trunk of an instrument. There are a lot of different things that are really just utilitarian. So people would have certain instruments depending on what was available to make those instruments. And I'm talking about traditional pre-European contact. So I realized through this, wood is chosen for grain. It really needs to be straight grain, unless it's something like this where you're literally burning through a big trunk of a tree. You want straight grain, and even with this you want straight grain. It needs to be bendable for a lot of different usages for drums. So people would traditionally do bending through a combination of soaking and then taking that wet piece of wood and putting it over heat and just very gradually bending it about something. I think that in the way that many cultures do. So bending is quite important. Carvability, which goes back to, again, grain. But for example, I assume everybody is here that you people know your woods. I guess that's the best way to put it, that are here and they have an understanding of hardwood and softwood and all these sorts of things. You don't find Native American instruments, for example, made of black walnut, which is a native wood, especially here in California. It's just too hard to deal with. I have actually a couple of different times with modern machine tools made flutes out of walnut. And the sound is okay, but in the end it's really, I don't like the sound as much as the sound of cedar. I also discovered through this process that I'm actually allergic to walnut dust. So put that aside. But people, you don't find really hard wood. You don't find flutes or drums made, for example, of hickory. These kinds of things. You find a very specific selection of woods. Now, if you look at this rattle over here on the left, this is from the Northwest Coast. And those people are really into cedar. But the other thing is, to do this kind of fine carving on instruments, you need to have not just a soft-grained wood, but something with a dense soft grain, I guess is the best way to put it. And there are certain kinds of cedar that really work well for that. And I'll talk about the tools that people make to do that. And then finally, what's important is oil content, literally. One of the reasons that people use cedar for flutes is because it's a very oily wood and it doesn't split that much. So you want something that if you're constantly putting moisture in it and warmth and then letting it dry and sort of contracting, you want something that is not going to split on you. And cedar, well, I should say something. I call this cedar, it's technically a part of the juniper family. This is the cedar that's used for like cedar chests and things that smells wonderful. This is my favorite wood to use, but people use other kinds of cedar. So oil content is really, really important as far as making sure that instruments don't split. And now, as far as the woods that are used, again, all of these things relate back to geography, what you can work with. Cedar is undoubtedly the wood for Native American instruments. There's no question of that. Bendability, grain, how common it is, especially in areas on the coast, in areas of California. It's, across the West. It's a major wood. Another wood that gets used a lot is cottonwood. But the cottonwood is when you have the trunk of a tree and you burn down through it. So it's not used really so much for rattles. I've never heard of cottonwood being used for a flute. But there are ways that you can create drums doing that. Now, sumac is actually a popular wood in areas around the Great Lakes, and people do use flutes. They do make flutes out of sumac. It's an easy wood to take sort of the pith out of branches, and people will actually burn through. I'm going to talk about techniques of instrument making. It's not really quite wood, it's more grass, but river cane is used for traditional flutes in the southeast and into parts of the southwest, and they even have river cane out here on the Santa Ana River. And this is an interesting situation because I met a Navajo flute maker and I was asking him about sources of river cane to be able to use for flutes, because I've thought about going out there, and he told me some areas where I could get it. It's really similar to bamboo, but the joints aren't quite as big. And then I realized, the problem is that in Native culture, there are a lot of different activities that you inherit or are given the right to do. Okay? I was taught by my father how to make flutes. I have the right to make this particular type of flute. Now, it's interesting because this is not a Choctaw flute. This is a Plains style flute. The right came to my family. This is one of those things that only happens in Native families. It came a number of generations ago when a Ponca family, Ponca are another Native tribe, and in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, a Ponca woman got really angry at one of my great-great-aunts who was making fun of her because she had a blanket over her shoulders, my great-great-aunt Priscilla. And the Ponca woman stabbed my Aunt Priscilla in the gut. And in order to keep this whole thing from going through kind of the white justice system, which was really nasty, the Ponca family agreed to pay different sorts of reparations to my family. And one of them, interestingly enough, was how to make these. And I had a great-great-uncle Otto who was taught how to do this, and then he taught his nephew, who was my grandfather. And so we inherited the right to make this particular type of flute. Now, if you get on, say, eBay, you'll see a billion of these. And many of the people who make them are not Native at all. Or many of the people who make them come from Native groups, for example, the Navajo. The Navajo make everything. This is not their style of flute. They picked it up from someplace. But I do respect the idea of inheriting the right to do this. And the problem comes up with the cane flutes is even though they're a Choctaw-style flute, nobody in my family has the right to make them. And so I have stayed away from doing this. I've thought of making one maybe just in my garage to see what it's like. I've got the tools to do it. But river cane is very workable. And it's local, it's out here. Actually, most of you are not local, are you? Or do we have local people here? Anybody? We're like, yeah. The problem with the Santa Ana River out by Riverside, where they have river cane, is I grew up, my mother told me, and I've still kept this in mind, she kept saying there's quicksand out there, and I asked my aunt recently about this, and she said, yes, there is. Somebody actually lost a horse in the quicksand. So that's another sort of fear. Maybe that's Creator telling me don't use the river cane. Another thing which is not quite wood, but it's close, is cholla cactus. People will use the hollowed out pieces of cholla cactus to make a kind of instrument called an Apache violin, where they seal the ends of it off and use the cactus as a kind of a sound chamber. It has one string. And it has a bow that uses horsehair, and the Apache people said they've been making them forever. There are other people who believe that no, they copied it from the Spanish. That's an argument that I'm just not going to get into. They're the only people that have that stringed instrument like that. And then finally, where you do get hardwood is, and actually with my folks, people will make what they call striking sticks, which are similar to an instrument known as a clave, which is just two sticks, and you hold one and you go clack, clack, clack with the other one. And people in the American Southeast use these, the striking sticks, as essentially a kind of a dance accompaniment. Now, in terms of technique, what do people do? And then I'm going to back up after this to the slide that had some of the instruments. Well, carving is obvious as far as dealing with wood. The way to carve wood finely is, ooh, those things are cool. The way to carve wood finely that people would do in native cultures actually make little carving, digging knife kinds of things out of beaver teeth. And so you'd make a handle and have it on with the beaver teeth in it, and then use these incredibly sharp beaver teeth to carve and scoop out with. And then you could actually sharpen them on a rock, just like a beaver would. Sharpen them up. So for fine work that was done, beaver teeth are the thing. After that, in terms of drums, you get bending and steaming. There are a lot of drums out there that look like this where the hoop is bent. This one actually is not. It's little interlocked pieces. But many drums of this nature, hand drums, are simply bent and then glued. And this is a really common technique to work with wood. Burning through is really important. People will take logs and cut a little out of the end, a big piece of a log, stump of a tree, and then put coals in it and then just let it burn through, sometimes for a couple weeks, just a little bit at a time. You just keep it burning, and you burn the hole all the way through. There's another technique which is used with flutes, interestingly enough, which are when what are called burning sticks are used. So people would have, at one time it was actually a tool with a little bit of stone on the end, and you'd heat that rock up in a fire and just start to burn. So traditionally, and I do a variation of this, the finger holes in the flute are burned through. This makes a lot of sense, you find out as a woodworker, because you don't tear up the wood at all. You don't tear little chunks out or anything like that. Burning is very controllable. People would also, at different times with certain kinds of flutes, actually burn through this direction as well. That was a little bit later, and it's commonly done with these homemade burn sticks, which are made out of old coat hangers. But before that, there was a way to burn as well. And then finally, gluing. Well, actually a couple of things, it's not final, which is where you do what works with flutes. You have a stick, like this, a branch of a tree, that is a pretty straight and has a straight grain, and you split it open, and you carve the insides of it out, and then you glue it back together. And that was normally done with pitch. And then what people would do to make sure that that pitch really stayed together is oftentimes it was ties all the way down. So if you see flutes that look like they're decorated just with a lot of hanging, tied together things, it goes back to that period of time where people used pitch. Nowadays, what is used by traditionalists is glue made, well, it's essentially hoof glue. I don't know how many of you do instruments and gluing and things. I like hoof glue, but it smells really bad. Is the problem with it. Stinky stuff. And then, well, how do you get this kind of finish at all? Well, people would sand in a number of ways. The people on the coast would use skin from sharks or rays. People are like, yeah, we do this. I think this is still done, actually, but very, very easy to find things to sand. The other thing you can do is use everything from abrasive sand to actually different sorts of rocks that are sandstones that are fine grained, and just smooth it on down. So it is important, and you'll see this if you ever see instruments in museums. You'll think, that's really finely made. Well, that's because people took a huge amount of time to do this, to make their instruments look nice, because the instrument, keep in mind, is considered in many ways to contain the spirit of the wood, the spirit of the tree, in some sense. I'm going to back up a little bit. And yes, I am keeping track of time. Okay? Different categories of wooden instruments in native culture. You have rattles. you find on the northwest coast especially. I mean, they're all over the place, but the ones, for example, in this part of California, only the handle is wood. Rattles tended to be made of gourds, with a gourd end to it. Sometimes a turtle shell is used. Sometimes there's actually a pouch shape that's made out of rawhide. You can do things with different shapes of rawhides, but wood is at least part of it. It's going to be the handle. And in this case, this rattle is from the Shipshan people of the coast of Canada, right where it meets with the southern part of Alaska. And these things are very finely carved. This is cedar. It would be made with beaver teeth to get it all carved in. Now this is the opposite of that in a way. This is a log drum. And by a log drum, we mean a big piece of wood, a log, half a log. People sit on a bench and they slam onto it with sort of like these wood slab sticks like this. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you can hit the drum and eventually you can break bones in your hand. They're really loud. They don't resonate that much. It's just crack, 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 crack. And these are used to accompany different kinds of dancing. These are common also in the northwest coast and in the mountains of California. People use these kinds of drums. Okay, so just slab of wood. Now this is a hand drum. You're seeing the front and the back. You'll notice the similarity with this and with this. Now we're about to hear what this sounds like, because this morning when I first got up, it was so humid it just went like that. And we'll see if it has any tone. I dried it out a little bit with a dryer, but then I came here. Oh, this is not bad. This kind of drum can be used to accompany vocal singing, or it can be used as part of accompanying singing that goes with dancing. It's never just played by itself. There's always a vocal part of some kind with it. Most of the time when you find these drums, they are made with a steamed hoop. This one is made with another technique, which is little pieces of wood. This one is actually, thinking here, it's fairly rough on the inside. It's actually cedar though. And the person who made it, who's a Northern Plains Indian, it's a Arapaho drum. What they did is they took small pieces of wood that overlapped and glued them right here. So each one of these pieces is glued in. That technique is actually, by native terms, relatively recent. It's maybe 150 years old. And it did come through Anglo culture, settler culture. For those of you who've been to powwows or you've seen native people in movies, everybody's sitting around a big drum and playing it together. People don't like to admit this, but those drums are patterned off of captured U.S. cavalry marching band drums. Those big drums like that, 200 years ago, native people were not using them. It's called the big drum, and there are a lot of different stories of the big drum, but interestingly enough, the story always involves somebody, and it's usually a woman actually, having this big drum within a historic time frame. People will talk about 1870, 1880, or what they'll do is they'll say, at the time of the Custer Battle, a woman escaped from the Lakota and moved east, and she had this big drum, and she lived on an island, tail feather woman, and she gave the drum to the Ojibwa people to play. Okay, so what you do get in this case is people will talk about the drum in terms of recent history. And nobody talks about the drum, before there were humans, the drum came through whatever. So there is a sense that it's recent. But these big drums are patterned off of cavalry drums, and people came up with this technique of gluing slabs of wood at edges on this rather than trying to bend a big hoop like that. When you do see a big bent hoop drum, what you'll find out about it is it's usually a commercial drum that somebody bought and like a marching drum of some kind, and stripped the outside off of it and then redid it. In terms of Well, I'm going to get back to the flute here in a second. I wanted to bring this because it's a native California instrument. This is a clapper, and it's sort of wood. It's made from elderberry. And what's neat about it is it had a soft pith, which was removed. And then these things are split open. They have a hinge like this, and it's... Now, what I find amazing about this is you only find these in California. That's it. So the instrument goes with the landscape, with the woods here. You don't find these anyplace else. The other thing is the native California people who use these don't use drums. In fact, you don't get drums in California until you get way up to the north coast of California. There are no drums here. People use clappers and rattles, and this is what they were given by Creator to go with their dance and their music. Okay? And this is actually a fairly important concept because there is no universal native culture in North America, no universal religion. Each group, you talk to people, was given the things that they need for their dance, their spirituality, their religion. This type of drum here is the one that's burned through with coals. So you have part of a tree. These are often cottonwood. You find these in the Southwest. And you just simply stick coals there to burn, 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 burn. And then finally we have flutes. I only have a couple minutes, maybe 1 minute. Flutes are usually made, as I said, of cedar. The standard thing to do would be to take a branch, split it, hollow it out, put the holes in, put it back together. In terms of construction of these, just so you know, people, if you buy a flute online, you're looking, it'll say something like, it's in the key of A, it's in the key of E flat, all these sorts of things. People didn't do that. Okay, a traditional flute is what's known as a grandfather flute or a grandmother flute. The way I was taught to make flutes is the length of the flute fits under my arm just like this. So every flute I make is made to my measurements, right? You have, I won't get into how it works other than there's a chamber here. It pushes the wood up here through an embouchure or the air and then back down. But the distance between here and this first hole is a palm and 2 fingers. The distance then between each hole is a thumb, just like that. Has nothing to do with being in the key of anything, because flutes were not played with other instruments. There were a couple of exceptions to this, they're very minor, but a flute is an instrument for a person. And so what I know is that the flutes that I make always play, and they play well, but they're made to fit me. And so anybody who gets a flute from me, I don't really sell them anymore, I did for a while. Anybody who gets a flute from me is getting a flute that is tuned up to a person. It's kind of a projection of me, in a way, in my physicality. It's also a projection of the particular tree that this came from. I tend to use wood that is actually from northern Michigan. I went to grad school out there, and I developed a relationship with a place that sells wood at Whitmore Lake, just big, rough pieces. So I'm just going to finish up by playing a little, just like a scale or a little bit of something on this so you can hear what it sounds like.